Mira Calloway grew up believing that fate always kept its promises. That was the story every pup in her pack heard before bed. Somewhere out there, a bond was already forming for you, tied by something older than blood, older than choice. When the moon marked you for someone, that mark was supposed to mean forever. She was 19 when the mark came. It happened at the gathering, the night every unbonded wolf in the territory stood beneath the full moon to see who the spirits had chosen for them. Mira remembered the cold on her arms, the smell of pine smoke, and then the strange pull in her chest, like something invisible had reached inside her ribs and tugged. She turned, and across the crowd stood Elias Voss, the future Alpha King, the boy whose family had ruled the Northern Territories for 6 generations. He looked at her the way people look at something they don't expect but somehow already know. The elders cheered. The drums picked up. Someone shouted that the future king had found his queen. Mira remembers laughing, not because it was funny, but because she didn't know what else to do with that much joy at once. She was young enough to believe joy like that was permanent. For the first 2 years, it almost was. Elias was not yet king then. His father still held the throne, still commanded the pack, still made the decisions that shaped their world. Elias was simply the heir, restless and sharp-tongued, more interested in border patrols than politics. Mira liked that about him. He didn't care about titles. He cared about being useful, about proving himself, about earning respect instead of demanding it. They spent those 2 years learning each other in the way young bonded couples do. He liked black coffee and hated when people apologized too much. She liked mornings by the river and hated when people raised their voice to make a point. He was clumsy with words but not with actions. He'd leave her favorite tea on her desk without saying anything, or walk 3 miles out of his way just to check that a trail she used was safe. She used to tease him about being a terrible poet with excellent follow-through. It wasn't dramatic love. It wasn't the kind you'd see in old paintings, full of longing glances and desperate confessions. It was steady. It felt like a promise that didn't need to be repeated because it was simply true. Then his father died. The pack said it was sudden, though later Mira would learn that sudden, among wolves, usually meant hidden until it couldn't be hidden anymore. Elias became Alpha King at 23, younger than any leader in the pack's history, and something in him changed the moment the crown settled on his head. He stopped laughing as easily. He stopped leaving little gifts on her desk. He started speaking in the clipped, careful tone leaders use when they're afraid that a single wrong word might crack the foundation they're standing on. Mira told herself it was grief. Grief does strange things to a person. It hollows out spaces where warmth used to live and fills them with distance instead. She gave him room. She told herself patience was love's quiet cousin and she had plenty of both. But grief has a season. It ends, or at least it changes shape. What Mira didn't understand, not yet, was that Elias wasn't grieving his father. He was grieving a life he hadn't chosen for himself. Being Alpha King meant 100 small surrenders every day. It meant every relationship became a political calculation. It meant the council whispered about who he should marry for strength, who he should ally with for protection, who his queen should be for the good of the territory rather than the good of his heart. And somewhere in those endless meetings, in those endless calculations, Elias began quietly wondering if the mate bond, the very thing that once felt like destiny, was actually just another obligation dressed up as magic. Mira didn't know this was happening in his mind. She only knew the results. Fewer visits, shorter conversations. A bond that used to hum warm in her chest now sat quiet, like a phone left on silent, still connected, but no longer expecting anyone to answer. She kept working. She'd trained as a healer since she was a teenager, and she buried herself in it, tending the sick, stitching wounds, sitting with elders through their final nights. Work gave her something the bond no longer did, a sense of purpose that didn't depend on someone else's attention. People in the pack noticed the distance between their king and his mate, but nobody said anything out loud. Packs are strange that way. They'll gossip in corners and go silent in rooms. Mira felt the weight of unspoken pity everywhere she went, in the way healers' assistants avoided eye contact, in the way elders patted her hand a little too gently when they said her name. She told herself she was imagining it. She was not. Cyrilda Marchetti arrived in the pack 8 months before the ceremony of binding, sent as an envoy from a smaller allied territory to the south. She was clever in the way that made people underestimate her, soft-spoken until she needed to be sharp, and she had a talent for making Elias feel like the person he used to be before the crown swallowed him whole. Mira met her exactly twice before everything fell apart. Both times were brief, professional, unremarkable. Cyrilda was polite. Mira was polite. Neither woman gave the other reason to suspect what was quietly growing in the spaces between council meetings and late-night strategy sessions. It's easy, looking back, to draw a straight line between 2 points and call it inevitable. But at the time, nothing about it felt inevitable. It felt like small choices, made one at a time, each one seeming harmless enough to ignore. Elias started staying later at the border outposts, the ones Cyrilda's territory bordered. He started asking Mira fewer questions about her day and forgetting to answer the ones she asked about his. The bond didn't disappear. Bonds don't disappear, not really, but it dimmed, the way a room dims when someone quietly closes half the curtains. Mira noticed. Of course she noticed. A bonded mate always notices, even when they don't want to. She confronted him only once, in early spring, standing in the doorway of his study, with her arms crossed and her voice steadier than she felt. "You're somewhere else," she said, "even when you're standing right in front of me." He didn't deny it. That was the part that hurt more than an argument would have. He just looked at her, tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, and said, "I don't know how to be both things anymore. The king the pack needs and the man you fell in love with. I don't think I can hold both." At the time, Mira thought he meant he was struggling. She thought it was a confession of exhaustion, not intention. She reached for his hand and told him they'd figure it out together, the way partners are supposed to. He let her hold his hand. He didn't hold back. Looking back, she understood that was the moment he'd already made his choice. He simply hadn't said it out loud yet. Some people don't leave with a slammed door. Some people leave quietly, one missed conversation at a time, until one day you realize the person standing in front of you has been gone for months. The months that followed were the loneliest of Mira's life, and she'd lived through the death of both her parents, so she knew what loneliness could do to a person if you let it settle too deep. She kept working. She kept smiling in council meetings. She kept pretending the whispers weren't about her. She wasn't stupid. She'd heard the rumors about the border outposts, about how often the king's schedule seemed to align with the southern envoy's visits. She didn't confront him again. Some truths you don't want confirmed, because once they're confirmed, you can't unknow them. The pack's ceremony of binding was scheduled for early summer, a tradition 300 years old, where the reigning Alpha King publicly renewed his bond with his mate in front of the full pack, sealing their union with a blessing from the elders and a new ring, one meant to symbolize not just partnership, but leadership shared equally between two people. No king had ever attended without his mate. It simply wasn't done. The bond was the foundation the whole ceremony stood on. Mira spent the weeks before the ceremony preparing herself the way she prepared for everything difficult in her life, quietly, methodically, without letting anyone see the effort it took. She had her dress fitted. She practiced the vows the elders would ask her to repeat. She told herself that whatever had gone wrong between them, the ceremony was a chance to start fixing it. A public promise renewed might be exactly what pulled Elias back from wherever he'd gone. She believed that, right up until the morning of the ceremony, when she stood in the hall and watched her mate walk in with another woman on his arm. Cyrilda wore blue silk, the color reserved for guests of honor, not political envoys. Her hair was pinned the way brides pin theirs. And Elias walked beside her with his shoulders squared, his chin lifted, the posture of a man who had decided, somewhere along the way, that he no longer needed permission to do what he wanted. The hall went silent first, then erupted into a low, uneasy murmur. Elders exchanged glances. A goblet slipped from someone's hand and shattered against the stone floor, and the sound rang through the room, louder than it should have, the way small sounds do when everyone is holding their breath. Mira stood on the dais where tradition required the mate to stand, waiting for the king to join her for the vows. She watched him walk toward the front of the hall, watched him stop beside Cyrilda instead of beside her, watched 300 years of tradition crack open in front of 200 witnesses. She didn't cry. She'd already done her crying, months ago, alone in a bathroom with the fan running loud enough to drown out the sound. What she felt instead was something quieter, something almost like relief, if relief could feel this heavy, because for months she'd wondered if she was imagining the distance, inventing problems that weren't really there, convincing herself that something was wrong when maybe it was just her own insecurity talking. Now she knew. It hadn't been her imagination. The elders looked to her, unsure how to proceed. Ceremonies like this had no precedent for what was happening. Someone whispered that they should postpone. Someone else whispered that postponing would only make the humiliation worse. Mira didn't wait for them to decide. She walked down from the dais, her steps even, her spine straight, the way healers walk into rooms where someone is dying and everyone else is panicking. She'd learned a long time ago that calm isn't the absence of pain. It's what you choose to do with pain instead of letting it choose for you. She stopped in front of Cyrilda, not Elias. The younger woman looked startled, unprepared for this particular kind of confrontation. She'd probably expected shouting, tears, a scene dramatic enough to match the scandal she'd stepped into. Mira reached down and slid the ring off her finger, the one Elias had placed there 2 years ago, the one meant to be renewed today in front of everyone who mattered to their pack. It felt strange coming off. She'd worn it so long her finger had grown a faint pale line where the metal used to sit, like a scar left by something that used to matter. She took Cyrilda's hand, gently, the way she'd take the hand of a patient who didn't understand yet how bad their situation was, and pressed the ring into her palm. "He's yours," she said. 2 words, that was all. No shout, no tears, no demand for an explanation. Nobody in that hall could have given honestly anyway. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Mira had ever heard. Elias reached for her wrist before she could turn away, his fingers closing around it the way a man grabs for something he didn't realize he was about to lose until it was already halfway out the door. "Mira, don't!" She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "You don't get to look surprised. You planned this moment for weeks. I just didn't plan on staying for it." She pulled her wrist free, and for a moment, neither of them moved, caught in that strange stillness that happens right before something breaks completely and everyone in the room can feel it coming. Then she turned and walked out. Not through the grand double doors at the front of the hall, the ones built for royalty, the ones that framed every dramatic entrance and exit in pack history. She walked out through the side door instead, the plain wooden one servants used to carry food and firewood, the one so ordinary most pack members forgot it existed. It felt right, somehow. She wasn't leaving as a queen making a statement. She was just a woman, leaving a room she no longer belonged in. The days that followed were strange in the way grief is always strange. Not a straight line, but a series of waves that come and go without warning. Some mornings Mira woke up and felt nothing but a hollow kind of calm. Other mornings she woke up and the weight of everything she'd lost sat on her chest, so heavy she had to remind herself how to breathe normally. The bond hadn't broken. That was the part nobody talks about when they tell stories about mates parting ways. A bond doesn't snap clean like a rope. It doesn't disappear because one person decides they're done with it. It goes quiet instead, dims down to something barely noticeable, but it's still there, humming faintly under everything, waiting. Mira felt it in small moments. A flicker of unease that wasn't hers. A brief warmth that came from nowhere and left just as fast. She understood, in a way she wished she didn't, that somewhere across the territory, Elias was feeling the same faint echoes she was. Bonds don't care about pride or decisions or ceremonies gone wrong. They just exist, quietly, whether either person wants them to or not. She threw herself back into her work at the healing house, the way she always had when life got too loud to sit still in. There was a strange comfort in it. Broken bones and fevers didn't care about scandal. They just needed tending, the same way they always had, and for a few hours at a time, Mira could disappear into that simplicity. Word of what happened at the ceremony spread through the territory faster than any healer's remedy ever could. Packs love stories, and this one had all the right elements: a king who broke tradition, a mate who walked away with more dignity than anyone expected, a ring passed from one hand to another, like a verdict nobody had asked for but everyone understood. Some pack members whispered that Mira should have fought harder, made more of a scene, demanded her place back through anger instead of quiet resolve. Others said the calm was the sharpest blade of all, that watching her hand the ring over, without a single tear, had done more damage to Elias's reputation than screaming ever could have. Mira didn't care much either way. She hadn't done it for the audience. She'd done it because she was tired of holding on to something that had already let go of her months before she was brave enough to admit it. 3 days after the ceremony, an envoy arrived at the healing house asking to speak with her directly. Mira recognized the crest on his cloak immediately, the Ashworth line, an old rival territory that had spent decades in uneasy peace with the Voss pack, more out of necessity than friendship. The envoy was polite, formal, and clearly uncomfortable standing in a healing house that smelled like crushed herbs and antiseptic. He explained that the Ashworth Alpha had heard about the ceremony. Everyone had heard about the ceremony by then, and wanted to extend an offer. Not a courtship, he clarified quickly, watching Mira's face for a reaction she didn't give him. A position. Beta of their territory, a rank that carried real authority, real respect, without any of the complicated politics that came with being someone's mate. Mira asked why. It seemed important to ask why, given how strange the timing was. The envoy answered honestly, which she appreciated more than he probably realized. The Ashworth Alpha had watched, for years, how the Voss pack underused Mira's skills, treating her healing work as a side duty instead of the vital leadership role it deserved. What happened at the ceremony had simply given him the opening to make the offer he'd wanted to make for a long time. Mira didn't answer immediately. She'd learned a long time ago not to make big decisions in the wake of big emotions. She asked for a week to think. She used that week the way she used most difficult weeks in her life, by working through it. She tended patience. She walked the river trail she used to walk with Elias in the early days, back before crowns and ceremonies complicated everything. She sat with the discomfort of not knowing what came next, instead of rushing to fill the silence with a decision just to feel like she was moving forward. By the end of the week, the answer felt obvious in a way it hadn't at the start. She said yes. The transition wasn't simple. Leaving a territory you've spent your whole life in means leaving behind more than a title. It means leaving behind the healing house she'd built her reputation in, the elders who'd trained her, the patients who trusted her hands specifically, not just any healer's hands. But it also meant leaving behind a bond that had turned into something closer to a wound than a comfort. It meant leaving behind whispered pity in every hallway, the careful way people avoided saying Elias's name around her, the exhausting effort of holding her head up in a place that had watched her be humiliated in front of 200 witnesses. Mira packed light. She'd learned, somewhere in the last 2 years, that the things worth carrying rarely take up much space. Elias found out about her new position the way kings usually find out about things that actually matter. Late, and from someone else. A council member mentioned it in passing during an unrelated meeting, assuming he already knew, and watched the king's face carefully as it became clear he did not. Nobody in that meeting said anything else about it. Nobody needed to. The silence in the room did all the talking that was necessary. What happened to Elias in the months after the ceremony is harder to piece together, mostly because he wasn't the kind of man who talked about his own mistakes out loud. But the pack noticed things. He stopped attending as many council meetings in person, sending representatives instead. He seemed shorter with people, quicker to frustration, the way someone gets when they're carrying something heavy and refusing to admit it. Cyrilda stayed, at least for a while. But a relationship built on breaking someone else's trust rarely survives on solid ground, and within a year, the two of them had quietly separated as well. No ceremony, no scandal, just a slow unraveling that mirrored the one Elias had caused in the first place. The ring Mira had pressed into Cyrilda's palm sat on her hand for exactly 4 months before Cyrilda returned it to Elias, without ceremony, without explanation, the way you return something that never fit right in the first place. Mira never asked about any of it. She'd built a new life in Ashworth territory, one that didn't depend on anyone else's choices to feel complete. Her work as Beta gave her authority she'd never had before, respect that didn't come with strings attached, a seat at the table that was hers because of her skill, not because of who she was bonded to. The bond between her and Elias never fully disappeared. That's simply not how bonds work, no matter how much either person might wish otherwise. But over time, the hum of it faded into something so quiet it barely registered anymore, background noise instead of a constant ache. Mira still thought about him sometimes, usually late at night, usually without meaning to. Not with anger, not anymore, mostly with a kind of distant curiosity, the way you think about a house you used to live in, familiar, but no longer home. She'd learned something in the process of losing him, something she hadn't expected to learn. Dignity isn't about how loudly you defend yourself. Sometimes it's about how quietly you walk away. Sometimes the strongest thing a person can do isn't fight for a place at a table that no longer wants them. It's standing up, taking off whatever they've been holding on to too tightly, and simply saying, clearly, without apology, that they're done. The pack still tells the story sometimes, at gatherings, the way packs tell every good story, until it becomes part of their history. They tell it differently depending on who's speaking. Some make it sound like a tragedy, some make it sound like a scandal, some make it sound like a warning. Mira, when she hears it, thinks of it as none of those things. She thinks of it as the moment she finally stopped waiting for someone else to decide her worth, and decided it for herself instead.